Hello, hello, welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I am Ulrike Schaede, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego. I'm also the director of jfit, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology here at UCSD. We are at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. GPS is an international relations public policy school. We have several degree programs, including one with a focus on the Pacific, and in particular Japan. If you're interested in our course offerings and academic programs, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. And at GPS, we have jfit, our Japan Center. jfit's website is jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go to that website, you'll find a number of tabs. One is called News and Media. If you go there, you can sign up for our jfit San Diego, Japan newsflash. It's basically unnews, or news you don't read in the normal newspapers. It's a bi-weekly newsletter. And right next to that tab is the Japan Zoominar tab, where you can sign up for upcoming events and also watch recorded past events. If that's all too difficult, you can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, or go to my website, thejapanologist.com. So today, of course, we have we'll discuss entrepreneurial revival in Japan with Rick Katz, but let me tell you what's coming up. So the JZ, the Japan Zoominar, is a weekly event every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. Next week, we'll have Mireia Solis from Brookings. She will discuss Japan's role in shaping the liberal trading order. And then the week after, and I'm gonna guide your attention to that a little bit more later, we'll have Bob Eberhardt to talk a little bit more about Japanese entrepreneurship, followed by Lisa Friedman on June 29th about women in Japanese society. And then we'll have Ken Shibusawa, the great grandson of Eiichi Shibusawa, talking about, believe it or not, a new era for Japan. And there's more to come, as you can see here. Please stay tuned. Our Zoominars are recorded, and you can watch past events at our website, jfit.ucsd.edu. Because that's so, today, when you type questions into the Q&A box, which you are absolutely encouraged to do, I will refer to you only by your first name to make sure that your privacy is protected. And since you're interested in entrepreneurship, please don't miss the June 22nd event with Bob Eberhardt on the many myths about Japanese entrepreneurship. But today, of course, we have Rick Katz here. So Rick has written 2 books, if not more. Japan, the System That Soured, that made him very famous, and it's a fantastic book. And Japanese Phoenix, which I believe was later. And he's working on now on a new book, which is tentatively titled Gazelles or Elephants. This is actually not the cover of the new book. I made that up. But the questions he's asking is about how these elephants and gazelles are going to shape up to form Japan's economic future. And with that, let me bring in the man. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
So Richard Katz has a BA from Columbia and an MA from NYU, both in economics. He's an economist. And the Japanese economy has been one of, or his favorite topic for many years. He served as a lecturer at Stony Brook SUNY, as well as an adjunct professor of economics at NYU Stern Business School. He writes columns for the Oriental Economist and Toyo Keizai Online. He's a senior fellow at Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. And Rick, many of the people here today are your friends. They know you. They've read your book, the Sour Japan. So here we are. Welcome to the show, Rick. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. So this is hopefully the Japan that is desouring. It's going to make hopefully will make a comeback. And the topic is really the revival of entrepreneurship. But what I need to do first to start is, when you say the word entrepreneur, everybody thinks you mean Silicon Valley and venture capital and high tech. But in fact, while Silicon Valley is a wondrous thing, it's really only a very small share of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is basically any kind of company that does an innovation, does something new. Most are not in high tech. So I'm going to do a screen share here. And, you know, in all of Silicon Valley, there are about 2,000 high-tech companies. No, next, here we go. All right, this is the number of companies in Silicon Valley that are in high tech. There are what the OECD defines as high growth enterprises, which are also been nicknamed gazelles. And they're mostly young. And these are companies that grow about 20% a year at least for 3 years in a row. And they're, you know, usually, you know, 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, maybe 50 employees, maybe 500 employees. There's 50,000 of these in the United States. In Italy, about 17,000. Korea, 13,000. The UK, about 12. France, about 10. We don't know how many there are in Japan, but this is not an American phenomenon. This is across the OECD. The reason we don't know how many there are in Japan is the government does not measure it. And if you think the governments measure what they consider important, the failure to measure tells you something. Now, so what do I mean by a gazelle? So this is one of my favorite examples. There's a company called Tokushimaru. And what it is, it's a 42-year-old community organizer realized that there are all these what they call food deserts in Japan, with millions of elderly people in depopulating towns. The young people have moved out, the old people are passing on, the towns have shrunk, and they've gotten so small that they can no longer support a grocery store. So millions of people have no access, particularly if they don't drive. So this guy decided in 2012 that I'm going to take a regular van and I'm going to design an inside of it so it can carry about 1,500 staples in the truck. And he started his company. And this is 7 years later. He goes to each town, delivers the stuff to all these elderly. They know him, they're friends with him. He's got 500 trucks, 500 drivers as of 2019, with revenues of $60 million, the equivalent. By next year, he hopes to have 1,000. And the reason you know it's a Japanese company is that if one of the elderly who normally shows up does not show up, the driver calls the authorities to make sure this person is not ill, right? That is a gazelle. It's got nothing to do with high tech whatsoever, but it really solves a need. And why did it have to exist? Because all the supermarkets never thought of doing this, which is why you always need new companies with fresh ideas. The old, decades-old companies are the elephants, and often elephants can't see what's in the room. Now, the reason why should we care about this is that for living standards to increase, output per worker, the amount of goods and services each worker produces has to grow. So in the 80s and 90s, firms that were less than 5 years old accounted for 3 out of 60% of the entire growth in manufacturing productivity in the United States. That's rather stunning. In Japan, the companies that scholars have studied and are able to identify as these gazelles are about 40% more efficient than the average firm. So gazelles in Japan are just as terrific as gazelles elsewhere. The problem is there's too few of them. There's a dearth of them. There are tons of small and medium enterprises, SMEs for short, in Japan. And this is in the service sectors. If you look down here, you'll see this is how they started off. This is how many employees they had. And you can see they're somewhere between 3 and about 8, all across the OECD. They start off within a similar range, but how much they grow after 10 years is very different. The US is an outlier. After 10 years, the average one's gone to 40 employees. In Britain, you know, it's around 23. Japan has the lowest growth, but they barely grow. You would see similar figures in manufacturing. So the problem is not the ability to set up a new company. The problem is the ability to have it grow. And what I think is there are several changes going on that are very positive that open up new possibilities for growth. Typically, one of the biggest obstacles to growth is how do you hire people? Because under the lifetime employment system, if someone leaves a good job, either start a company or work for a startup. Most startups fail. well, they'll never get a good job back. So it's very, very risky. But the situation has now changed. More and more people in their 20s and 30s, particularly if they're at a specialized skill like information technology, they're much more eager, not just willing, but eager to switch jobs, to try new things, to build a company from scratch. And companies have had to adjust to this. So this is back in 1999, less than 40% of companies would do mid-career hires. They wouldn't hire you if you're already 35 or 40. They want to groom you from the start. Now it's over 70%, and that including the big firms. So the risk of going either starting or working for a startup has really shrunk. That's very, very important. The next thing going on is career women have become a secret treasure for gazelles. At a traditional company in Japan, it's very hard for women to become managers. And usually people who have experience of some level of management at a big company are the ones who create new companies. So you can see for men, half of the men who've been at a big company for 30 years get to the level of kacho as a section chief managerial role. Only 20% of the women. By this time, these people they're in their 50s. They don't start new companies. You got to be a manager back here when you've been 16 or 20 or 11 or 15 years. So the women who cannot get promoted at the traditional companies, they go to the gazelles. They fill them up. You go to a gazelle office and you'll see tons and tons of career women and managers. So it's bad for women in Japan and bad for Japan turns out to be helpful for gazelles. The second really positive sign is technology. And technology can create tremendous social revolutions. Well, traditionally under the distribution system, where the big retailers and the big manufacturers use them as gatekeepers, it was very hard for small companies to grow. E-commerce has really changed that. So right now, Rakuten is wonderful, but what's really wonderful about it is what it means for small and medium enterprises to grow, in my opinion, if we're talking about the impact on the entire economy. There are 46,000 SMEs that in 2019 sold $35 billion worth of goods on Rakuten's site alone. Never mind Yahoo, Amazon, and all the rest. So one example is a furniture company. It was a family firm started in 1964. The father did not believe in e-commerce. When he died in 2002, it had $1 million in sales. His children took it over, put it on Rakuten, and then 17 years later, it had gone from $1 million in sales to $170 million in sales, and all of its suppliers also grew. Now, the final point here I want to make now is, I am sorry, went back from the, there we go. Again, why is this important? The reason it's important is that living standards depend upon productivity. How much GDP a person produces in an hour. Japan spent these decades catching up from 40% of the US level, finally peaking around 70% around 1998, 99, right? And it's gone back now. You can't see it because it's blocked, but it's now back down about 62%. Whereas, oh, here, I can move it. There you go. Whereas the rest of the G7, it hit a peak of 91% of the US level, and it's more or less stayed the same. So this is a problem. Japan's going backwards. And one of the reasons is that the elephants, the big companies, have not been able to change with changes in technology. So if you look at 2010, the total sales of the Japanese electronics industry was $480 billion. It's gone actually down to $340 billion in the last 11 years, while around the world, the electronics industry itself was growing tremendously, but Japan's was sinking. Because where's the must-have product from Sony? They used to produce a must-have product every couple of years. They no longer do. That's why you need new gazelles, a balance of old elephants and new gazelles, replenishing it, fresh ideas. My bottom line here, and then I'll stop, is I think there are a lot of positive signs about these gazelles. The question is, will they hit a critical mass that has become a large enough share of the economy to really help the entire economy will revive, or they will simply remain interesting companies. My view is under business as usual policies, they will not reach critical mass and Japan will still be in trouble. But the potential is there. There are reasons why politicians should want to listen to these trends. And so I think it's not an impossible dream. I think it's a very possible dream and hopefully will happen. And one of the purposes of the book is to contribute to that dialogue. So let me stop there.
That's terrific. Thank you. So there's a lot of material here. So what I hear you say is you spent time in Japan to research this, and you saw a lot of gazelles, and yet you didn't find enough. So can you talk a little bit about what the obstacles are? Why are there not more gazelles in Japan?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that the second biggest obstacle to finding gazelles is getting financing. You don't have, I'm not talking about venture capital again for the Silicon Valley, but you don't have actually that many millionaires that people can borrow from their friends and family, or they are what they call angels that fund new companies. The banks don't want to lend to people who are under 30, which is a lot of founders are under 35. They don't want to lend to new companies. They demand, it's harder for a new company to get a bank loan in Japan than anywhere else in the OECD. We can go into details about that if people want to. And the problem is that in order for a company to grow, it actually has to start off at what economists call a minimum effective scale. If it starts off too small to be able to afford to do the R&D, to get the modern machinery, hire the best managers, hire technical people, it will never grow. So that's the problem. They start off, they want to grow, but they can't get the financing. The other issue is just all sorts of government policies which are intended to shore up incumbent companies, whether large or small, efficient or inefficient. For example, every country in the OECD gives financial aid to research and development, which is a big factor in how many gazelles you have, even for so-called low-tech companies. Japan, only about 10% of all the government's financial aid goes to companies with fewer than 500 employees. That is the worst ratio in the entire OECD. They give their money to the people who already are cash rich, who don't need it. So you have other policies, and when the government gives they pay lip service to promoting new companies, promote gazelles, they say all the right words, and some people are very sincere and actually try to do real things. But on the whole, they really protect the incumbents, and when you protect the incumbents, that doesn't leave any room for new people to come in. Those are the obstacles that I see.
So let me step back a little bit and ask this: who's the audience for the book that you write? So the book is about gazelles and elephants. So you talk about how, I got a little preview. So you talk about how, of course, the gazelles are very important, and the elephants are in the way. And so who is this written for?
Well, first of all, to take your last sentence first, countries need both elephants and gazelles, as well as mice, which are your corner drugstore that will never get big, and that's fine. So every current elephant used to be a gazelle. Every gazelle that really grows, some of them, a few of them will become elephants. But at some point, you can't be superb for decade after decade after decade. You lose freshness and fresh ideas. And Sony is kind of a poster child for this. So you need a balance. The problem is that Japan has got too much emphasis on the elephants and enough on too little on gazelles. And not that many elephants can learn how to dance.
But, yeah, we want to go to the dancing elephant, but before I do so Japan has had 20 years now.
Is just anybody who's interested in Japan's economic future, whether they be a business person or college courses, will be interested. But also, all around the world, governments are trying to promote gazelles. Particularly in Europe, it's a big cottage industry, less so in the United States. So this is a case study of a country that may or may not make it, what's working, what's not working. And there's a lot of cross-country data and comparisons in the book. So I think anybody who's interested in the issue of entrepreneurship should also be interested in this book, whether or not they're particularly interested in Japan.
So for the last 20 years, if not more, I would say 25 years, the Japanese government has proactively structured these all kinds of policy measures, including actually the INCJ, which is was supposed to show that venture capital can be done in Japan. Some of the funds were hijacked to save some elephants, but regardless, there's actually a lot of money, billions, tens and hundreds of billions of dollars have been earmarked to support small firms. Whether they all arrive is a different matter, but what people tell me is that they're actually access to money is not the issue. There are some issues that the VC are too risk averse, and the amounts of money are so small that the Japanese startup guys are spending all of their time getting a large number of small investments rather than one big one and so forth. But the government has done a lot to support these startup companies. Why do you think that those measures are not more effective?
I have two answers. One, they've spent billions. They haven't spent hundreds of billions on startups. They spend tons of money on small companies, but the issue isn't small companies. The issue is actually new companies. So that because after you're 40 or 50 years old, you're really not going to do something new. Japan has the oldest SMEs in the entire OECD. So for example, the government has credit guarantees, an awful lot of credit guarantees, again, the most, but most of these are to protect small firms that, if left on their own, would go bankrupt because they're not good. On the other hand, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of SMEs which are profitable shut down for lack of successor, and that has to do with the financial industry, but that's another topic. So they really haven't given as much as you'd think. The venture capital industry, so they get about $2 or $3 billion a year, but compared to the United States or Israel, even European countries, it's really tiny. But you hit one point on the head, which is the amount an individual firm would get. An individual firm might get a couple 100,000, maybe a couple million, as opposed to when it really needs.
Yeah, not even.
They're not going to, and so you start off small. They're pushed also to go public way too soon, as Evan was talking about last week. And then once you're on the stock market, you've got to be concerned with earning money today rather than plowing everything back so that you can grow. You know, for years, Amazon reported no profits, it reported losses, and people were saying it can't last. That's because it kept plowing all the money back in. The second side is you cannot, if you're protecting incumbents who should be leaving the scene, that is a barrier to new firms coming in. In other words, if you want to open up a store, you need the real estate. But if there's a mom and pop shop that stays there, there's no real estate. If they're getting the money from the banks, there's no money for you. If they're employing workers, there's no workers for you. And what you see, let me share the screen for 1 second again here, is that, here. What you see is that this is the death rate of firms that employ people. So not just a family company with only family employees. These are firms that actually employ non-family members. This is the rate of exit of them dying, and this is the birth rate of new ones. And you can see it's a pretty clear trend. The lower that you let firms exit, the less you let zombie firms exit, the fewer opportunities there are for new firms to enter. And Japan has the lowest rate in this group of the deaths of old firms, and as part of the reason why it has the lowest rate of entry of new firms. And again, I'm saying the problem isn't just entry, the problem is the ability to grow. That's the key issue. You can start off a company, but if the barriers to growth are too big, you're not going to have the results that you want.
So we're having a lot of interesting questions coming in. And actually on that point, Evan is asking whether you are actively promoting that Japan should switch its approach to these matters and let companies go, right? Thereby increasing the metabolism, if you wish. And if so, how that would even fit Japan's social policies and great effort to, keep plugging along without tearing the social fabric, as Evan calls it.
That's a great question, and I promise I didn't set him up for that. I think that issue of the social safety net is actually the most important political obstacle to entrepreneurship, because in Japan, your job is the social safety net. The public overt government paid social safety net is actually quite thin. And in the past, you didn't need it because you had, nice growth, equal distribution of income, full employment. So your job worked, and that was great. But now you've got 60% of the labor force is full-time regular employees, 40% is what they call the precariat, the non-regular employees. Their wages are much lower, their jobs are very insecure. And so people really are holding on very tight to their jobs or to their company. And so there's political pressure on the government to shore up these moribund companies. Now, there is an alternative. You don't have to go, full Reagan Thatcher neoliberal. The fear that that's the only alternative to the Japanese system is, I think, one of the biggest obstacles to reform. And the third way is really, I'm very, very impressed with the Scandinavian model, which they call flex security, which it combines the best of the market to produce wealth, but with a social safety net, security, equality of income, et cetera, to make sure that income gets distributed, but also when people lose their jobs, they're retrained, the government engages in matchmaking. These countries spend about 1.5% to 2% of their GDP every year, what they call active labor measures, to help these transitions. Japan spends the second least in the OECD. The US takes the prize for spending the least. And so people are afraid of creative destruction and have a right to be, because there isn't a social safety net. So I think if you
we can't tell Japan that they should become Scandinavia. There's just no willingness to pay taxes in Japan at the same level, right? So an 80% tax rate is not going to fly ever. And so Japan has found its own way of creating the social cohesion by way of building employment into the social contract, and by the way, into the constitution. And so it's not actually quite true that all non-regular workers in Japan are precarious, if you just call them. 10% of them are actually very super high paid specialists, like IT specialists that don't want to work for legacy firms and actually earn quite a solid living by being just experts. And many people in consulting are in these positions. So we need to be a little bit more careful, I think, with the data, but the fundamental idea that Japan could somehow turn into Sweden, I think that's just not a way that would ever work for Japan. Other than that, I completely agree. I think as you know from my book, there's actually a new initiative in Japan to see whether a certain social cohesion could be created by allowing employees that work for large firms to go on a sabbatical and become a gazelle and see whether they like it. And if they do, that's fine. Then they can sell their stuff to the former employer. And if they don't, they can come back, no questions asked. That system is still pretty small, but it is one of these attempts to kind of see, can we build a Japan-style innovation ecosystem whereby we take a little bit away the risk, and by basically telling people, if you fail, there's still a future for you, right? Sure. And we'll see whether that works, right?
I think, Japan is actually very good. I'm not saying Japan becomes Sweden, and I'm certainly not saying Japan should become the United States. Japan should be Japan. But Japan was very much able to handle a lot of turbulence in the labor market, a lot of people switching jobs in the high growth era because the overall economy was growing. So they are losing the social contract which they once had. Equality of income is a problem, security is a problem. With the aging, how are you going to afford that? So you take steps. One step is, for example, this distinction between regular and non-regular workers. The law says that all workers should be paid the same for equal work, regardless of whether they're regular workers or non-regular workers. But the law is not enforced. There is no agency of government which is authorized to actually investigate cases where this is violated. There's no punishment for violating it. When the only people, if you have a problem, you've got to go to the expense of going to court and hiring a lawyer yourself to complain. And what the companies do is they say, well, what's equal work? And they do some little, I spoke to a lawyer about this who represents the companies only, but he was quite candid. He said, listen, they do some tiny little tweak and tell the judge that, well, see, it's really a different job because it's 99% the same, but 1% it's different. Even though if it's, say, in a factory, they're doing same work side by side. And the one case he lost, the company went back to him and said, well, what additional tweaks should we do so we can go back to the judge and say, now it really is a different job. They did it. The judge said, yeah, it's different. So one way you would start is by really making sure that there is equal pay for equal work, whether you're regular or non-regular, a man or a woman, the promotion opportunities, etc. And even some unions now are including non-regular workers as well as regulars. So there are some potential changes on that front. And so you build on these changes and you have a snowball effect. Doesn't change overnight, but I think there are better ways to promote social cohesion than what they've got now. I think they're losing social cohesion.
So we have some social cohesion brings me to the old people and social people, so social issues. So we have some questions. Robbie has a question on whether there are some labor reforms or other reforms that you think could increase productivity. And Rick cautions, the other Rick, that we need to be a little bit careful not to compare apples and oranges, which I completely actually agree with. When we measure productivity for Japan, it would be more reliable, he says, to look at working age population in the denominator, not because Japan has the highest number of older people working, right? That's just it's just so, and for a number of very good reasons, I kind of think it's a good thing. But if we look at and these older people are often in make work jobs because it's part of the social contract, right? So if we were to look at productivity by working age, so we cut off everybody over 65 in that calculation, then we would have a slightly better comparable number. So what do you say to both of these
okay
comments?
Let's do one at a time. So the labor reform issue, well, I mentioned one labor reform, which was actually enforce the law that exists. Just like the Financial Services Agency investigates whether banks are obeying the rules and insurance companies, there should be within the labor ministry or some other agency, someone who actually investigates whether companies in fact are doing equal pay for equal work, equal promotion opportunities, regardless of that status or women. One of the things that would occur is, Japanese companies traditionally, because of lifetime employment, spent tons and tons of money on training their workers. And that was one of the sources of productivity. If the machine broke down, the person there knew how to fix the machine. The people who are the irregular workers, and I don't mean the 10% of them you're talking about are consultants, which I think is a fine thing, but those who are not, who do it because that's all they can get. They don't get the training. And Japan's only resource is its human capital. So if you're taking a third, let's say it's a third of your workforce rather than 40%, and you're not giving them the training you were giving the rest, then when the machine breaks down, there are lots of cases, actually machines broke down and the whole factory was shut down for a couple of days because there was no one there who knew how to fix the damn thing. And so you want to create a situation where companies not only are compelled to pay people equal wages, which means that if you take another job and it disappears, you've got a good fallback option. You don't slip into the non-regular class. But also it gives companies incentives to really give these workers the training. And that would create a tremendous improvement in productivity. Now, as far as the Rick's question, yeah, what I'm measuring is GDP per work hour. So the work hours, I mean, yeah, the absolute level might be different by a few percent, but the trend of having hit a peak and going down is more or less the same. It doesn't really alter the big picture, which is that while other countries are moving forward on productivity, Japan sure has productivity growth, but at a lower rate than it should. And as a result, it's falling behind. It's reversing the catch up, which was its original post-war measure. So I do think it's an accurate measure. We've got apples and green apples.
Well, there's more to that topic, but we get a lot of questions on the gazelles. So let's turn to the happier side of the book. Let me give you three, and then you can take them in whatever order. Julia asks whether you can talk a little bit more about, give us some meat, right? So talk about the backgrounds and personalities of the entrepreneurs that actually become these gazelles. And Richard wonders what policies the government could adopt to help them more, right? So because you end on that note, this is actually one of the questions that I have, right? So you say the government should listen, but given that the government has tried a lot, what else could it do? And then Raj wonders whether immigration might be a key. As you know, he says Silicon Valley has a very high degree of startups by immigrants. Would that work? So let me stop there and let you catch up with.
Can you remember all three in case I forget? So let me give you an example. This is one of my favorite gazelles. So it's a company called Rocksool. The founder of it, a guy named Matsumoto, was 23 years old when he created the company. He had been working for A.T. Kearney, an American consulting firm, and he was working for clients who produced Meishi. And he realized they spent an awful lot of money on marketing. If only they were what ended up being, he called an Uber for business cards before Uber actually existed, where they actually had a website and an auction system that someone who needs business cards, a lot of them, and somebody who makes them, they could meet on the website and bid, and you get the bid. And then he started this company, and then 3 years later, he did it for trucking. Now, trucking is really interesting. Parcel delivery. In Japan, the top three companies have 90% of the market. 30,000 companies, truckers, struggle for the rest of the market. Their trucks are normally about 40% full, as opposed to 60% in Europe. It's hard to make a living with a truck only 40% full. So he's got this Uber for parcel delivery. He's got 1,500 trucks now using it. The truckers themselves are independent. They don't belong to him. They just use the website and pay fees. So if you got a butcher that needs to get his meat from here to the grocery store, he said, how much will you bid to carry my stuff? And for the trucker, if it's just going a little bit out of his way, he says, okay, the extra cost is nothing, but meanwhile, I've filled my truck. Now, not only does the trucker make more money per mile of driving because he's got more packages, there's less pollution because you need driving fewer miles to carry the stuff, therefore less global warming. The truck owner makes money. The butcher shop or the flower shop or whatever gets a good deal on price. Everything's terrific. So this guy was looking, he first wanted to see, I want to see a company that's doing this so I can join that company. It's only when he realized that there was no such company, he started his own. He's a KO graduate. His biggest problem was he knew nothing about how to run a business. He was a visionary who didn't know how to manage. And every year, 40% of his staff left because he didn't know why. So he said, I hired some veterans. I said, you mean guys in their 50s? He goes, oh no, they think in the old ways. I mean, guys in their 30s and gals in their 30s who came in and people had spent time as managers in bigger companies. They said, you haven't really talked to your employees about the mission. What is the company doing? It isn't just making money. What is it doing for Japan? Look at the impact we can have to really improve Japan. And so within a year, instead of 40% turnover, it was down to about 5% turnover. So you need the combination of the visionary and the managers. And he said, the thing is about 5% of people my age, we don't think the way these 50-year-olds think. We're very international. I spend 3 or 4 months out of the country all around the time. An awful lot of the founders have some international connection. They've gone to a university in California or Cambridge, Stanford or MIT, and sometimes some other schools as well. You would know more about that than I do. But you know, an awful lot of them have worked abroad, traveled abroad. They're excited. They're really, really excited about what they're doing. And one of the passages in your book that got to me, because I had a similar experience, after meeting all these young, bright, ambitious, energetic people and not having to wear a suit and tie, I went to a meeting with an executive in his 50s at one of the giants, household name, who was in charge of what's called open innovation, where they're supposed to cooperate with new companies, other companies. He was tired. He was just waiting till his retirement day. He didn't even know what his job really was. He was putting in the hours. And that tiredness, that grayness that you describe, that's what you don't feel in the gazelles. You feel energy. You feel, wow, this breath of fresh air. It's exciting. And these are people who say, in 5 years, my company will have sales of $1 billion. And they mean it. And some of them will get it. So it's very, very exciting.
So
The question was what?
Yeah, the other question was the gaijin. Should we let the gaijin in to help with this energy? Or would that ever work in a Japanese culture? There's also actually a question about culture, right? This might actually fit with the immigration question.
Well, you know what?
What is culture really? How much is culture in your view? I have my own view on this, but my own culture is an obstacle in your view.
Okay, that's a whole bit. Look, we can get back to that. Let's get to the gaijin and then we'll get back to culture.
Well, they're also related to culture, right?
Right. In my view, you know, okay, countries have got cultures, but how the culture manifests itself in behavior really changes over time. And the question is culture 80% of the story or 10%? I think it's more like 10%.
Well, you know that my definition of culture is the norms of behavior. So you can change a culture and it changes by way of people behaving differently, right? But right now what we see is that there is in society, I think this is the question, this sense that once you fail, you failed. And if many people in Japan still see a young person who does not work in a lifetime employment position as somebody who must have failed, right? He wasn't good enough to get a job at whatever, Mitsubishi Sumitomo, so he started his own company that can't be good. But so as long as society looks down on the gazelles as players or people who couldn't find a better job, then that status issue remains a severe obstacle, right?
Well, let's see if it is. First of all, Japan was very entrepreneurial, not only in Meiji and early Taisho, but in the high growth era. So this is not as if entrepreneurship and risk taking, et cetera, are strange to Japan. They did a survey of MBAs in Japan and France and the US and India. And questions like, do you agree with the statement, I love to fight for my ideas even against opposition. I love to come up with an original idea. The Japanese and the Americans were each more like the other country than either one was like either the French or the Indians. In countries which are entrepreneurial, which we think of as entrepreneurial, the amount of people who actually form companies are about 4 or 5% of the adult population. Now they have even more of them working for them. Japan is about half of that. So we're talking about a shift of a few percent of the population who's willing to do it. If you have the labor market becoming more flexible, where the loss of a lifetime job does not mean failure, you have a fallback option, then the behavior changes and the attitudes about it will change. A mother who doesn't want her daughter to marry an entrepreneur because he doesn't have a secure job, I don't think that's a cultural thing. I think it's a realistic appraisal of what the situation has been. So if you change the situation, then attitudes will change. So I think of culture as a more, long-standing thing. One more thing, I've asked these women, again and again, women in their 20s who got some sort of a job in Tokyo or a big city, and I said, in terms of your hopes and your dreams and your ambitions and your frustrations, are you more like your grandmother or more like your counterpart in New York City? They all say my counterpart in New York City. Nobody says I'm more like my grandmother. I think the culture thing is overdone. Now, as far as
we disagree on the definition of culture, but I think what let's just name it society.
The people who say that Japanese are inherently risk averse and conformist and they won't do it, I think that's just wrong.
Yeah, well, that's obviously. I mean, that's not that's. I have a great question from Bill, and it's actually my question. But since Bill is asking it, I can use him as a front man. The older firms exiting, preventing newer firms from entering, assumes a zero-sum game in innovation. And that's exactly my beef, right? So economics as a discipline assumes that there's a zero-sum game, that the old guys have to leave for the new guys to come in. The Bill's question is what is actually the mechanism that older firms prevent newer firms from entering? And I'll piggyback on that and say, why is this a zero-sum game? We're growing, right? So is it really necessary for old guys to go for the new guys to come in? I mean, old elephants can dance. Elephants can be innovative. Elephants can actually work with young firms. They can buy young firms. They can invest in young firms. They can buy young firms' products. So why are you assuming a zero-sum game if you do?
Okay, well, actually economics is, part of our bylaws and our secret handshake is we have to believe in growth. So I don't think
growth is good. Everybody believes in growth.
Okay. So, but what happens is, and this is not unique to Japan, it's in every country, or at least I shouldn't say every country, in most countries, most developed countries and otherwise, but the developed countries, what we're talking about here. Institutions, after a while, become very set in their ways. There's a really famous book called The Innovator's Dilemma, where all kinds of companies that have a certain business model, they become very hostile to any sort of technology that would threaten their business model. IBM was famous for buying up patents to prevent the product from being produced because it would challenge their existing products. Hewlett-Packard passed up the chance to buy Apple because it said it's a toy, it won't work. The supermarkets who didn't see this idea of getting trucks going around to the villages, they just don't see it. There are some elephants who learn to dance, but they tend to be the exception. Why did Sony, which was so powerful and a must-have product every few years in the analog era, really, why couldn't they produce an e-reader that Japanese buyers wanted to buy? The Japanese buyers preferred the Amazon one. So typically—
can I just answer that question? Is it a rhetorical question or should I answer?
Let me finish my point, then you can answer. So typically what happens is that when there's a new technology, particularly in industry like electronics, where a radio and an e-reader are different products, whereas a vehicle is a vehicle. So autos is a different industry. But where it's changing so much, typically it's newer companies that are able to think of the new technology, think of the new product. And if there are enough of the new companies, some of the old companies under pressure of competition from the new ones will be able to change their ways. But most do not. And so they may still survive. IBM is around, it's a good company, but it doesn't set the tune in computers anymore. And so—
well, okay, so that's my answer why Sony is no longer there, because IBM has decided that they will no longer be a computer company and moved away. They vacated that space and made room for gazelles. But that doesn't mean that IBM has to die. IBM can become a different company. Sony missed out on, yeah, well, Sony is a long story. It's actually a really bad example. I think we should stop talking about Sony because it's just a managerial failure story. And, it's like talking about Sears, going on and on, talking about Sears. So Sony, by the way, is still alive. They decided they were going to be a content company. They are a movie and a visual content company. They have a 40% global market share in CMOS chips, which is an electronic device that they need to make the PlayStation. And the PlayStation competes, yeah, because the hardware is good, but it's fundamentally a content company. So Sony decided they don't want to be an electronics company anymore because they want to focus on content. Now, was it a stupid decision? Yeah, maybe, right? Because now we know that Apple had, ate their lunch. So they moved into the content before they had thought that through. But that's a managerial decision. And to turn Japan's story around, by the way, Sony is still employing more than 200,000 people and making tons of money. And so, it's not a failure at all. But the larger point here is Sony doesn't have to go bankrupt for Japan to be entrepreneurial. I mean, this idea that you need old guys to make room so that young guys can play strikes me as too simplistic. That I think actually the opposite is the case, that you need the old guys, the elephants, and their demand and their consumption and their requests for new ideas if you want to build an innovation ecosystem. So for instance, in Silicon Valley, one of the largest players of Silicon Valley are large firms that buy small firms.
See, that part I totally agree with you on. Yeah. Well, I'm not saying Sony has to go bankrupt, just the same as IBM didn't go bankrupt. But it's not just Sony. The top 10 Japanese electronics, Hitachi, Toshiba, Panasonic, go on and on and on. The top 10 firms in Japanese electronics in 2011, every single one of them is a smaller company today than it was 11 years ago. They're shrinking as in absolute terms, not just as a share of the market. And so new leaders have to come up as this is the cycle of life. It doesn't mean Sony should go bankrupt. Now, what I do think it should have, and one of the most interesting potentials in Japan, is that Japanese companies have up till now wanted to try to produce everything in-house. And they're really unable to do so to master the skills of this new digital era. They don't have people inside who really know how to do it. Honda tried to produce this autonomous driving system and the collision preventing sensors. They couldn't do it. They tried, it failed. They finally bought them from Bosch. But the R&D people at Honda were up in arms. We're selling the soul of our company. What you need is what's called open innovation, cooperation between the big and the small, and the big procuring stuff from the small and even acquiring them from the small. Although I noticed when KDDI set up a department to cooperate with smaller firms, they put the people in charge of that in a totally different building, a totally different section of Tokyo from the headquarters. If you look at the way they dress, they look like they're from Stanford or San Diego. They just have that sort of global uniform, the khaki pants and stuff. So they would not be burdened down by the big company culture. There's a gazelle called Linkers, which again, a young man, I forget his university, and I think he'd spent time abroad, but I have to check. It's called Linkers. What they do is they're a marriage broker between big companies that needed technology and gazelles that are inventing the technology, and they bring them together. And they have a network with regional banks and regional local chambers of commerce, and they also want to be $1 billion company in a few years, and they're well on their way. And so there are this trend of collaboration between the elephants and the gazelles would be a terrific thing for Japan. It would rejuvenate Japan. A lot of the Japanese companies that have tried to do it, like this person I met at one of the giants I mentioned before, they can't even spell the word virtually. Other companies are much, much better at doing it. And so there'll be a sifting out process. Some of the companies have set up offices in Palo Alto to try to cooperate with firms in Silicon Valley. And when I spoke to somebody from Asahi Glass, which is doing that, which does this kind of cooperation and open innovation, he was saying they're more willing to cooperate with an American gazelle than a Japanese gazelle because they can treat the American company as a kind of a peer because they're different, but they want to treat a Japanese SME like a subordinate. And the Japanese SMEs don't want to be subordinates. They don't want to be slaves. They want to be kings of their own castle.
So two more comments on this. Susanne says, well, aren't the gazelles the elephants of the future? And so this is just part of the ecosystem, right?
Exactly.
And Bob, who will, of course, be with us in 2 weeks and add some more data on this, says, well, if you look, I mean, we're talking about what many people, especially in Japan, talk about Apple and Microsoft and even Amazon as if they were gazelles or Intel. But those are old companies. I mean, Apple is what, 40? Microsoft, certainly, right? Amazon is now 30 years old. So these are not gazelles. Silicon Valley is not a gazelle place anymore. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about much smaller things, right? And so Jim wants to know whether you need an ecosystem, whether you need a critical mass. Is it possible? So is Silicon Valley not still the predominant model where you just you co-locate them, everybody's there, you do lunch, you run into people, you know, there's this networking, the young guys meet the older guys and the adult supervision on the management side, but also the money. And so what can Japan do to build an ecosystem? And is that really the model? Because you could, for instance, New York has a vibrant, as you know better than I do, has a vibrant startup scene, but not a whole ecosystem around it.
Sure. You know, I learned this actually from a 22-year-old when I was at a conference at Microsoft office in Manhattan at a JETRO conference. Entrepreneurs are very, very social. And this particular young man, he grew up in New York. He thought he might work at Wall Street. He thought he'd go to Columbia, work at Wall Street. He ended up going to Berkeley instead. And all the friends he met at Berkeley were all talking about starting their own businesses. And so he decided, well, this is kind of interesting because he wanted to do something that would make the world better. He said, well, doing a business. And so he did it. And universities can be a tremendous, tremendous incubator for creating entrepreneurs because it becomes a social community. Then you have neighborhoods that become social community. And you have social events where people get together and they regale each other with stories of how they screwed up this month and how they failed this time. And next time they'll do better, and they laugh and they drink, and there's a lot of alcohol. Yeah, so it's very much a social phenomenon. What you also need are the mentorship. Venture capital, again, it's a small slice of capital. One serial entrepreneur in Japan referred to trying to say an ordinary SME should get venture capital is like putting rocket fuel in your Chevy. I mean, you don't want to do it. But you do need these kinds of communities. You also need mentorship. So there's a professor at Keio who is himself a former serial entrepreneur, very, very successful. He's teaching courses. He's got lots of students, and he brings in existing entrepreneurs who give lectures. And one guy said, I'm going to offer a prize. You have a contest, develop a business idea. And whoever has the best business idea, the group's 20 groups of 5 each. I'm going to fund that idea. And he ended up, there were 3 ideas he thought they were good enough to fund. So he said he would fund all 3. At the end of the year, the teacher said, how many people would consider the possibility of at some point becoming an entrepreneur? Maybe not at first, maybe work for a big company, get some experience, but at some point in their life, half the class raised their hand. Now, most of them are not going to do it. But if 5% of the class did it or 10% of the class did it, and you have a lot of professors like him who've been there, one of the biggest secrets to entrepreneurs is people are entrepreneurs mostly who know of other entrepreneurs that they've met. And so, yeah, the social aspect, not to mention the accountants, the lawyers, and all the other stuff you need for the ecosystem. Sure, ecosystem is absolutely essential. And that is something organic.
And the large firms. who buy. So we're running out of time. I've promised Professor Hugh Patrick from Columbia to always ask his question. So I'm channeling Hugh and ask you this as a final question. What worries you most?
I mean, aside from the fact that Hugh might not buy the book and want a free one?
About Japan.
Actually, he's responsible for the book. We had a lunch conversation 5 years ago. He asked me some questions, and that led to the investigation, led to the book. My biggest fear is that the force of inertia will cause Japan to miss another opportunity, that there's a real opportunity here. Things can happen. There's a lot of fatalism in Japan because there's been promises and promises unfulfilled. And so this fatalism could overwhelm the potential of the hope that that's my biggest fear. And it would really be a shame because there's a genuine possibility here that you would not have to revolutionize Japan's society to do it. The changes are not that huge, in my humble opinion. That's my biggest fear.
So I hope in the book you will tell us also what you would consider a success. Since we now talked about the failure, at what point would you be happy to say, yes, Japan has actually changed and changed its ways to allow for innovation? I don't know whether you have an answer for that right now, but
well, when the number of gazelles looks something like what you have in, say, France or the UK, where the growth rate is higher, where the living standards, real wages are rising rather than falling, where the budgets are okay, so you can actually finance the elderly. So yeah, sure. There are very clear measures of success.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is up. This is always the problem. We have to stop. Our parents told us to do that whenever it's fun is the best. So we're done for today. However, we will be back. Next week, we'll talk about Japan and the world order. And in 2 weeks, we'll have Bob Eberhardt from Stanford with the business perspective on entrepreneurship in Japan. So we will continue this conversation, and I hope you will join us then. For today, thank you, Rick. Terrific conversation. It was great to have had you. And I hope we'll see you again, everybody, until next week. Please take good care, stay safe, and enjoy. See you later.
Thank you.